We're going to talk about rashes because no matter who the patient is, there's always rashes involved. And the bad thing about rashes is they always look red and bumpy. And so they kind of all look alike. And no matter how good you are, no matter how many books you look at, the rash that you see in real life never looks like the pictures in the book. And so they're always red and bumpy. And so if you were a dermatologist, a skin doctor, then you have the luxury of biopsying these red bumpy rashes, but we can't do that. And so as family members or as hospice nurses or people who visit, we don't have the luxury of technology and things. We have to go by what we see and what we hear and get clues. So I always tell people, especially my students, that when you see a patient, instead of being this doctor or specialist in San Jose with all technology and tests available, it's almost like being a doctor in a small town in the middle of Montana. Sometimes the nearest lab or testing site is 60 miles away and we just don't have access to all those things. So sometimes we just have to be good clinicians or good detectives. And that's what family members and hospice staff have to be, is good detectives, because we can't take them to these facilities to do these fancy tests. And so we have to be like that doctor in the middle of Montana who we can't drive to a lab because there aren't any labs. Okay? So I always tell people it's like you're a detective coming onto a crime scene. So when you enter the patient's room, all of a sudden you have to kind of rely on history and good detective work. And you don't know what it's going to be. You don't know if it's going to be a murder or robbery or whatever. You're just there on the crime scene and you have to figure out what happened. And so rashes are like that. It's like they're all red and bumpy and you have to kind of come to the crime scene and try to figure out what caused that rash. Is it something we're doing, or is it something that is internal? You know, these are the things. You have to get clues. And so 80% of the time you can actually determine a diagnosis by the history alone. And I handed out a list of different common rashes that people get, and most of them are clinical. And so that means that just by clues, that what you see and what you gather from the family and whatever, you should be able to at least have a good idea what caused it, okay, because most of them are clinical. So the common ones that we see are either fungal or moisture related. And so usually the clues are where they are. So again, if it's in places that trap moisture, it's either fungal or moisture related. So common places are in the groin, under the breast, in the armpit areas, around the neck, the diaper area or the buttocks area. So these are where moisture, sweat and urine or whatever feeds the fungus or causes irritation to the skin. And so they're all red and bumpy, but again, the clues are sometimes, if you have the main rash, and I've said this before, if you see little satellite lesions, a red bump away from the main rash, that's usually more fungal. And so even if you have a baby who has a diaper rash, the diaper rash will look red, but if you have the red rash and you have these little bumps away from the main rash, it's usually fungal. And the same thing with patients as well. Okay. And so there are other clues that we can do. So besides how it looks and where it is, and if there's a site of moisture, there are things that we can do without biopsying it or doing anything fancy. So one is we can just treat it. Treat it with a fungus medicine or treat it with protective diaper rash cream, and if it goes away, then we're done. Okay, so one way is just to treat it. And that's what a lot of people will do, just treat it, and if it goes away, great, we're right. If it doesn't go away, then we try something else. But there are things that you can do as a hospice nurse, and one is to use black light. Okay, so this is a black light, and basically, it really is just a black light. But if you want to give it a fancy name, this is called a woods lamp. And what's interesting about fungus is that sometimes it will glow. So if I held this against my skin, nothing will glow, but certain funguses, like ringworms and whatever, will actually glow with a black light. And some funguses will glow bright orange, but most of them will glow bright green. And so you hold it a few inches away and you look at the skin, and if it's glowing bright green, then it's probably a fungus and not a moisture related or some other kinds of rashes. Okay, and basically this is just a black light. So you can have a black light bulb that you can buy at the dollar store or whatever, and you can tell if it's a fungus or not. So not all funguses glow, but a lot of the common ones can. And so it's something very benign. You can do it easily and know, is it a fungus or something else? Okay, so this is called a woods lamp, but again, it's really just a fancy black light. Okay. The other thing is you can actually look under the microscope. And so if you get the fungus area, or what you think is a fungus area, and you get a glass slide and scrape a little bit of the skin off, you can actually bring it to a place with a microscope, and I have a microscope in my office, where you can actually look at under the microscope for fungus. And so fungus is usually inside of the skin cells, and it's hidden away by all the dead skin and whatever. So what we would do is we would get your sample of skin, put a few drops of potassium hydroxide on it, and then we look under the microscope. And so what we're doing is that in cowboy days, people made soap out of beef fat and lye. And so what we're basically doing is the skin cells are basically bags of fat. And so if we add a little bit of potassium, it's like adding lye to beef fat, and we're making the cell turn into soap. And so the cells will pop open, and if there's fungus in the cell, then the cell will dissolve, and what's left over are these fungus that you can see. And they look like little branches of twigs, and they won't dissolve in the potassium. So you can actually dissolve the skin cells, and if there's fungus, the fungus will be left over, and you'll see these branch things under the microscope. So without doing a biopsy or without sending it to a lab, it's something that we can just do with a microscope. So one is clinical. You just look at where it is, what it looks like, the story behind it, and you can decide if it's something to treat with antifungals like nystatin or clotrimazole. Or we can use a black light to see, and I have it in office if you want to take it to one of the patients to see if it glows in the dark, and that will tell you if it's a fungus. Or again, we can get a little glass slide and scrape some off and see if we can find the fungus. Okay, so those are common things that we'll see in patients, in babies, in a lot of places. Okay. The clues that also you want to collect is, again, where it is. So if it's all over the body, then it's probably something internal, something that they took in, whether it's medication or they ate some foods that are allergic. But if it's only on the arms or the legs, only on the exposed areas, then it's coming from the environment. So you can tell a lot about where the rash is. Is it all over, or is it only on the places that aren't covered by clothing? Okay, and so in timing. So is there some kind of new soaps, detergents, sunscreen, chemicals, Are they on a new medication? And usually if it's an allergic reaction, it should appear within about 30 minutes to a few hours after they took something or put something on their skin. So again, you're being a good detective by looking at the crime scene and kind of taking a history from the witnesses or the families or whoever that are there to give us a story. And just by putting all these pieces together, sometimes you can tell what it is. So location of the rash, and then eczemas usually go on where the bends are, so on the bend of the arm, behind the knees, but it also could be anywhere. There's another thing called psoriasis, which is very common, that is thickened, flaky skin, but that's on the other side. So eczema is usually on the bends, and psoriasis is usually on the knees and the elbows. But again, it could be anywhere, but those are very common places. In psoriasis, you can actually look at other clues, like if you look at the nails, sometimes the nails will have pits. And so that will tell you that it might be psoriasis because psoriasis affects the nails, whereas other things do not. Okay. If it's kind of a red, purplish rash on the legs, oftentimes that's a vasculitis. And vasculitis could be because of medications, it could be an allergic reaction to something, or it could be a viral infection. But a lot of times we'll see purple rashes on the legs only, and usually it's inflammation of the blood vessels called a vasculitis. Okay, and so a lot of times a steroid will make that better. Okay, so a lot of times the rashes are very common. You'll see it all the time. There are all sorts of rashes, but they all look red, bumpy, and sometimes they're itchy and sometimes they're not. But again, taking a good history and looking to see what clues are available, what is around that area, where it is, what happened, will give you a good idea of what to do next. And so a lot of times you can make the diagnosis just by being a good detective, and sometimes you can walk into the room and just that certain smell can give you an idea right away without even touching the patient or asking anything. So it depends on how good of a detective we are. And so we don't have the tools and the techniques that a lot of specialists have, because we're like that doctor in the middle of Montana, in the middle of nowhere. And so we have to use our good detective work to decide how to treat and what we're treating. Okay.